In life, I didn't seem to cope with things so well. And there was always this, why can't you deal with things? You're smart. Why can't you figure this out? And I think when Chris is talking about giftedness being beyond intelligence, we're sort of starting to understand that when someone's an outlier to that extent, it is really a sort of difference in their neurotype and you experience the world differently. But I always had some awareness of that I was experiencing life differently to other people. I thought I was just odd. I didn't realize that there were other people out there having the same experience or, the same difference in experience that I was. And not understanding that really puts an anchor in the water for you when you're trying to sail through life.
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me as we revisit a previously recorded conversation with Chris Wells and Emma Nicholson, in which we take a communication perspective on giftedness, belonging, and positive disintegration. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. Whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being. At the top of the episode, you heard one of our conversation partners today, Emma Nicholson. Emma, along with Chris Wells, hosts the Positive Disintegration podcast. Emma also creates further content related to the Theory of Positive Disintegration, or TPD, on her website, Tragic Gift, and her YouTube channel, Adults with Overexcitabilities. Chris is a writer, social worker, and the founder of the Dabrowski Center, which is a nonprofit dedicated to advancing the theory of positive disintegration. So very much a parallel to the CMM Institute and what we do for CMM. I'm so glad to be able to share this conversation with Chris and Emma again, because it's neat to look back since so much has happened and so much has emerged out of just this one conversation. We originally released this conversation in two parts in April and May of 2023. And since then, truly so much more has happened to solidify the relationship between CMM and TPD. Recently, myself and Sergey van Middendorp, who's one of the stewards of the CMM Institute and who you may remember from a bonus episode he joined me for last year, he and I were guests on Chris and Emma's podcast just last month. I've included a link in the show notes. You can go check that out and give them a listen. It's a great follow-up to this conversation. And even more recently, Sergey and I were able to give a presentation on CMM and TPD at the 2024 Dabrowski Congress that Chris and Emma hosted. And you can access the recording of that for a small fee on the Dabrowski Center website, so I'll also include a link to that in the show notes. Given all this recent energy around continuing this conversation, I thought that this was a great time to reshare it. Also, I think it's a meaningful addition to our Unheard Stories series for a couple reasons. First, now more so than when this conversation was recorded, I have a better understanding of the community that Chris and Emma have formed. And I recognize that many people come to TPD via the gifted community because it resonates with many people's experiences in that community. Giftedness, along with neurodivergence and mental health struggles in both those contexts, still remain unheard stories in many ways. You'll hear Emma especially talk about how the only stories around giftedness she was seeing were for parents of gifted kids or were only relevant to giftedness in the classroom. So she found herself creating resources for adults navigating giftedness like she was and still is. Again, there are just so many different ways to be and communicate and think, and the more stories we can hear about all those different ways, the more space we can make for all of us, and the better we can construct our social worlds to accommodate these ways of being. On a different level too, this relates to unheard stories because I know that the reason many people resonate with TPD immediately is because it offers them a new and better, more empowering story, a new lens through which to understand their experiences. When the only story you've ever heard about yourself and the way you are in the world is negative or narrow, then hearing new stories can be incredibly empowering because it invites you to make new meaning. So I hope you'll hear that in today's conversation. This is also the last conversation for this month and this theme, so as you listen along, I invite you to especially be thinking of this conversation in the context of all the other conversations we've had this month. So let's wrap it up with Chris and Emma. Hi, Emma and Chris. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm really looking forward to talking to you.
Thanks for having us. It's great to be here.
Good. I'm glad to have you. I'm happy to just jump right in if you are ready to go into it, and just start by introducing yourselves, keeping in mind that the context of the podcast is stories. I wonder if either of you have some stories to share that might help us have a better understanding of who both of you are going into this conversation.
Well, thanks so much for having us, Abbie. Yeah, I think that stories are really the best way to help make sense of the theory that we work with. I am a writer first. I feel like when I was thinking about how to introduce myself, I thought, well, I'm a writer. My educational background is in sociology, social work, and psychology. And I study this theory of positive disintegration. And when I try to help people understand what it means, I talk with them about the fact that I grew up kind of knowing that I was an extreme outlier. I was identified as a gifted kid, but there was never any discussion of what that meant. And I took my difference to mean that there was something wrong with me. And so I ended up going kind of in and out of the mental health system in my 20s. Positive disintegration in my life has been very real, and mostly made sense of it through like the lens of pathology until I had positive disintegration as a different framework to understand myself. So I'm not sure if that was a decent introduction or not. I don't know if I should go on and on with it, but I certainly could.
It's a great start. I think that's a good place. We can jump to Emma and then get into more of it as, the rest of our conversation unfolds. I'm sure we'll hear more stories.
It's weird because I tend to say everything in stories anyway. So
perfect.
This is probably perfect for this podcast.
Yep.
Like Chris, I grew up gifted, but really outside of the school context, it didn't mean a whole lot. And particularly in my young adulthood, I struggled a whole lot. A couple of years ago, I had what I'd call the dark night of the soul. So I had a very big disintegration and I didn't know what was happening to me. So I went to the internet looking for answers. And I think I Googled something like, why is my brain breaking? And accidentally stumbled across the theory of positive disintegration. And I had kind of a moment like the ugly duckling seeing itself in the water for the first time and realizing it was a swan. When I read about overexcitabilities, when I read about the process of disintegration, suddenly my life sort of made sense. But in my hunt for resources after that to make more sense of the theory, I found that there wasn't a lot of easily accessible information out there. And what was sort of aimed at parents of gifted children, which didn't apply to me in my 40s, so a little too late. So I wanted to do my part to make this theory a bit more accessible. So my background is a business analyst and I work in project management, and a lot of my bread and butter has been taking technical info and simplifying it. I started doing YouTube videos and just putting my stuff out there on the internet for all to see. And eventually I met Chris and we both had this shared passion for making the theory accessible. So that's how we ended up doing the Positive Disintegration podcast together. From my perspective, I don't have the wealth of knowledge that Chris does. So all I really have to offer people is my stories and tell them about what I've been through, and hopefully that will resonate with them in some way.
Absolutely. And I know you phrase it as, all I have are just my little stories, but that's really the most powerful thing in my mind. And I see similarities in myself of kind of coming to some of the communication theories that I've gotten to interact with, in that it's comforting. It feels like community when you get that language to be able to put into words something you've already known to be true in yourself, but you just didn't have the language to say it. And then on top of that, to understand that you're not the only person that experiences that. I think it's helpful around the making meaning, which is where I want to enter into our conversation with this making meaning point, because you both use the same wording to say, Chris said, I was told I was gifted, but nobody said what that meant, or I didn't know what these things meant. And so I wonder if you could first start talking about what is giftedness and what did it mean to both of you?
Well, what is giftedness is such a tough question because you can be gifted in multiple domains.
Okay.
There's no consensus definition for it. But for this podcast, I think that we should think of it as intelligence. That's how I'm going to talk about it. That was my experience of it. Growing up, being tested, learning that I had a very high IQ. Of course, giftedness is broader than IQ. You can't only think of it from that lens. But that was the lens that I was given when I was young. Some people, it's achievement. It's what they do in the classroom, which is not necessarily the same thing. You can be a high achiever and not have this like psychological giftedness of having very high intelligence. And then there are other domains. I'm not a musician. I'm not like an artist. You can be gifted in those areas. And so there's so many ways that giftedness can look. But when I was a kid, it felt very much tied to achievement, even though I wasn't a high achiever, and so the fact that I didn't perform in the classroom made me feel even more like there was something wrong with me.
Emma, what does giftedness mean to you?
I guess when I was younger, it did mean that achievement scope. So, I got through school quite easily, with the academic sort of lens. But in life, I didn't seem to cope with things so well. And there was always this, why can't you deal with things? You're smart. Why can't you figure this out? And I think when Chris is talking about giftedness being beyond intelligence, we're sort of starting to understand that when someone's an outlier to that extent, it is really a sort of difference in their neurotype and you experience the world differently. But I always had some awareness of that I was experiencing life differently to other people. I thought I was just odd. I didn't realize that there were other people out there having the same experience or, the same difference in experience that I was. And not understanding that really, puts an anchor in the water for you when you're trying to sail through life. Finding out about it later sort of frees you from some of that stuff. And it's that connection of realizing I am not alone in this. Part of that whole ugly duckling moment of figuring out what's happening to you is also understanding that you're not just this weird little oddball sitting by yourself in a corner of the world. You're having this different experience of the world and, suffering and struggling alone. There are actually other people out there who are like you and who can identify with that. I think part of the powerful thing of the podcast is every time we get on there and share our stories and our guests come on and share their stories, we then get feedback and emails of people saying, this is what I needed. I needed to understand that I wasn't alone.
Yeah. I think that's so important. And that's why in like CMM, we talk about we're co-creators and we talk about collaboration. And so, yeah, sharing those stories is, I think, an invaluable part of that. Emma, I know that part of the language that was important to your self-discovery in this was around overexcitability. Can you explain that? Teach us what that is?
You're asking the non-academic one to explain what overexcitability is. Oof.
No, see, this is what we need because it shouldn't just, that language, I think, should be able to be, everyone should be able to understand what that means, it shouldn't just exist in the world of academia if it can be helpful to people like you, right?
Okay, here's a challenge round. All right. So my understanding of it, and I'm happy for Chris to correct me if I stray off the path a little bit, is that overexcitability is a neurotype, I guess, where a person is particularly sensitive and responsive to stimuli, and that's both internal and external. So everything in the world around you is very rich and detailed and loud, and everything going on in your head is also quite rich and detailed and loud. And there's 5 areas where that covers. So the first one is psychomotor, so having a lot of energy and a need for action and a need for movement. You have sensual, which is pertaining to the 5 senses. So what you're receiving from the world is very, very rich and intense. Then you've got intellectual, which is that not just intellectual capability, but that thirst for feeding your mind, to want to question things, to want to think about things, to want to analyze things and ask a lot of questions. Then you have imaginational, so a very strong imagination, being drawn to imaginative pursuits, running away with daydreams and things like that. Well, that's what it means for me. And the last one is emotional, which is quite important because it means having quite intense, complex emotions occurring. And we had a guest on our podcast that sort of described it as some people have the standard box of crayons with 8 or 10 colors in it. Maybe they color with one crayon at once.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have the big fat 64 color with the sharpener in it, and sometimes you're picking up a handful of crayons and like doodling away with 8 at the same time. So I guess it's that intensity of experience, and that difference in experiencing the world is a qualitative difference. You are basically having a different life, a different experience of what reality is.
I know I'm maybe putting you on the spot here asking this, but do you have, as you've, done self-reflection and consider the theory for positive disintegration in your life, do you have a kind of example of how that overexcitability showed up in your life?
Unfortunately, I've got tons of them. So I cover across all 5 overexcitabilities, and whether you're talking about the inability to sit still, being easily bored in class, continually daydreaming, which is something I do even to this day. I'm very easily distracted by my imagination. I've always got to question things. I always overanalyze stuff. I read between the lines even when there's nothing there. And I have these great big whopping complex, powerful emotions that hit me like a freight train every now and then. And at many points through my life, I thought that was just me not coping with life. And it turns out that my emotions and experiences were valid. And yes, they were powerful and complicated, but that was okay.
Chris, do you have anything to add about overexcitability from an academic perspective?
Well, I wouldn't even do it really from the academic perspective. Well, maybe a little. Like the only thing I would add really is to say that overexcitability is a really old term. You can find it, in like the 18th and 19th century in writing. Well, maybe not the 18th, but
not recent though.
It's old. When I was doing my deep dive, I found it in William James's Principles of Psychology from 1890. It was also known as nervousness. And but Emma did a beautiful job. It's so much better that she asked you to describe it, Emma, than me, because I would have given like a definition, so that was perfect. And then though, the thing that I would add about how it shows up in my life is from the emotional perspective. And that is that I really value relationships. Relationships are like the most important thing in connection. And when we talk about emotional overexcitability, it's like a strong attachment, to other people, to places, to things, to pets, and so that relationship connection is really important. And I was also thinking, I want to throw this in before we go far away from it, and I don't have a chance to say it, but giftedness, we need to co-create that story and that meaning. And that's what we're missing. And those of us who work in this field and work with it, it's that there's been all of these academic arguments for decades and this recycling of issues. But what we really need to do now in the 21st century, from my perspective, is to come together to see where the meaning is, to create this story together of what giftedness is, where it's going, where it shows up in our lives, and what meaning we can make from it. That's the part that seems to me to be missing.
Yeah.
From the field anyway.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And it's making me think. I had a conversation earlier this year with a woman named Stephanie Higgs, and she's a gifted educator. And so she talked about giftedness in schools. But like you said, that's only one part of the story of giftedness. But I think what was important about our conversation is that something that I see through the lens of CMM is talking about she would come up with individualized learning plans for her gifted kids. And I think maybe that's part of this conversation that you're saying needs to be happening, is that the question is not, okay, how do we fix these people with overexcitability, with giftedness that are experiencing the world differently, and do something so that they can just accept the stimuli of the world, but how do we adapt the social world to the way that people experience it, recognizing that not every person experiences the social world in the same way. So how can we make the social world do the changing on the outside rather than the inside, I guess? And I wonder if that resonates with you both, because you've talked about those labels being maybe a burden or something that made you feel like you were the problem, the ugly duckling, or, whatever Emma was calling it.
I think that part of the problem is that we've been dealing in stereotypes for so long of what giftedness is, because we talk on our podcast a bit about the overlap between giftedness and other neurotypes when it comes to overexcitability. So we know that people that are autistic or ADHDers, they also experience overexcitability, but there's been very little understanding of that and research done and even stories collected and examined. And this is really, I think, the next step of what needs to happen. But as long as we have stereotypes of what it means to be any of these things, we're not getting to the heart of the matter with any of them. And it's really unfortunate. And it's held us back for far too long, in my opinion.
Anything you want to add, Emma?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about stereotypes, there's always two sides to every coin. And I think the problem with the term giftedness is it implies a gift. And as the saying goes, if this is a gift, can I give it back? People say it in terms of advantage, but there's also disadvantage. And side note to Chris, I think this will segue down into dynamisms just quietly. So there's good things about it and there's bad things about it. Like with overexcitabilities, there's, if you have a rich imagination, it can lead to creativity, but it can also be quite distracting. And when you're talking about gifted kids needing plans, when I was at school, there was no sort of accommodation for that. And I remember very clearly being in kindergarten and being held back one day by my teacher. I was in a composite class with kinder, first and second. So I had a lot of older kids in my class. And I was a troublemaker. I was not doing my work. I was up. I was talking to everybody else. And when I talked to my dad about this experience of me being held back, my parents being called in, he said, well, basically, you were bored. You're bored out of your brain. You were doing stuff that was just too basic for you. And that's why you were over-nosing with the bigger kids to see what they were doing because it was more interesting. And when the teacher said, well, I don't want to bump her up a couple of years because it'll hurt her, social development. My dad just went, well, if you're going to bore the brains out of her, then her behavior is your problem.
Yeah.
So he was always like, I was very concerned school wouldn't keep up with you. And if we don't recognize that, kids are experiencing the world differently and have different needs.
Yeah.
And we're not meeting those needs. We're just going, here is the standard round peg, round hole curriculum.
Yeah.
Then we're not doing it. And then that carries into your adult life as well. That carries into workplaces and, our relationships and interactions. When Chris talked about forming really strong emotional attachments, that has been fantastic in my life, but has also been horrendous and led me to situations where maybe I should have left, but I was far too attached to a person. And so there's a good and bad side to everything. And when it comes to the theory of positive disintegration, and probably Chris can talk a little bit more about this, there's these dynamisms or feelings that help kind of shape your behavior. Some of them aren't so great. Things like guilt and shame and dissatisfaction with yourself. And when you're wired to feel everything more intensely, you're going to feel those bad feelings like more intensely as well. It's not just the good things, it's also the bad stuff.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing when you talked about the 5 different kinds of overexcitability is that, being in touch with your emotions, being in touch with your senses, being in touch with your imagination, all have the capacity to be positive things and the capacity to overwhelm everything else and make the experience a negative one, or, whatever language you would put to that. And so maybe it's about balance. I think what it's drawing a connection to in my brain for me is that I've always been someone that was driven by stress and anxiety. And only recently have I been able to distinguish, okay, stress up to this point is healthy and productive, actually. But there's a point beyond that where the worry about what's going to happen, the worry about the things I can't control, it doesn't serve me. And so letting that go. And so I wonder if there's some of that in the theory for positive disintegration of finding this balance, or I wonder what language you use around that. Is it regulation? Is that the core of disintegration?
Well, first, you made me think of something that is kind of important, I think, to add about the overexcitabilities just briefly, is that if you remove emotional and think about the other four, they're all not only ways of experiencing the world, but also of processing emotional tension. And so tension is a really important thing in this theory. And so having these overexcitabilities produces inner conflict and external conflict. And so Dabrowski said that the dynamisms come from the overexcitabilities. They are producing, especially the ones that Emma talked about, are clearly like emotionally charged guilt and shame, dissatisfaction with yourself. Because, the tension aspect of overexcitability is something that I think gets lost sometimes for people. Like when you think about them as just characteristics or traits in somebody, then you may miss the fact that they're producing this conflict inside of yourself. Like inner conflict is a really significant aspect of the theory. So I wouldn't say that Dabrowski really talked about balance or coming to some kind of homeostasis. And yet he did talk about transforming overexcitabilities. He absolutely believed that through your own autopsychotherapy and self-education, you can learn how to live with this intense experience of reality and let it guide you well, which is what the dynamisms do. And another thing that, I was like wanting to just mention briefly is I've heard them called like spurs to self-correction. That's what Michael Bihovsky, one of the scholars of this theory, talks about. And I kind of love that phrase, spurs to self-correction, because that's exactly what we need in order to live well in the social environment, to be good citizens, to be good people. We need to be able to recognize and self-reflect and know that our behavior has caused somebody else anguish too, maybe, and we need to do better. And so that's really one of the essential aspects of the dynamisms, is that they help us to do better, to make better choices, to improve ourselves and do that work of inner transformation. That's another thing that gets lost often in the conversation about this theory, is that positive disintegration, it's work. Like it's work to transform yourself. It doesn't happen easily. It's tough.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think coming back to the basics of positive disintegration, what we're talking about is rebuilding values. And if you think about values, values are our principles of how we behave. There are standards of behavior. What is important to us drives our behavior. And that's all about how we interact with other people. But as Chris said, it's those spurs of correction. So it's like carrots and sticks emotionally to correct you to, well, what is really in alignment with your values and what is not in alignment with your values. And we hit a point sometimes in life, it's for some people it's very early on, even in childhood, and some people it's later, where we start to question our values. And the reason why the theory is called positive disintegration is that, you get values from the day dot, from when you're a kid, from your parents, from school, from religion, from wherever you're told what is right and wrong. At some point, if you start to question that, first of all, it's like a big Lego brick house or something. You've got to pull all those pieces together in order to do that self-examination and that work, and then figure out, well, what actually do I feel are my values? What is true to me authentically? And then rebuild from there. And those dynamisms of, things like guilt and shame of how you behaved, those feelings are like those spurs, those carrots and sticks that say, no, that was not cool. What you did then, how you behaved with that person, not good. And it's basically your continual self-correction. But the thing is, like when you get spurred, you think about a horse. If the horse doesn't turn in the direction, it's going to keep getting spurred, right? So if you keep ignoring that, it's going to get more and more intense.
Yeah.
And you will just keep getting those little stick pokes and those little spurs until you actually do something about it and start walking your talk.
Yeah, that's definitely a helpful way of understanding that in terms of the personal growth. Yeah, we've obviously already hit on a couple elements of the theory of positive disintegration. So I want to kind of maybe pause before we get too ahead of ourselves and ask you to provide, I know there's probably a succinct or maybe not academic definition of the theory,
So I'd love to ask you maybe what that is and then how you both understand it as well. But I'll go ahead and preface to take some of the pressure off of you and tell my listeners to check out your podcast and your first episode that has, a great, more in-depth description of what the theory is than what we'll have time to get to today. So I know I said that my theory is complex. I know yours has a lot of layers as well. So don't feel like you have to hit on all of it. But I just wonder, after we've talked about, a couple different of the elements, how do they all relate to each other? How do they come together to form this theory? Chris, would you start us off with what the theory of positive disintegration is?
Sure. It's so hard to say in a nutshell, but there is one quote. So this quote is from a paper from 1983 from Lisi and Pahovsky. The main idea of Dabrowski's theory is this: it is emotional life that empowers and guides an individual toward a higher level, because it is passionate involvement that makes us capable of empathy, understanding, caring, and finding a goal beyond self that gives our lives meaning and direction.
Yeah.
I just haven't found any other brief nutshell definition that captures it that well. I mean, because part of what made it so hard for Dabrowski to get his theory accepted in his own life was the way that he valued emotions so much at a time when they were seen as not important or not valued, where cognition was king. And,
right.
Emotion was like something to be denied or repressed and certainly not celebrated. But to him, emotional life was the most important thing, and it guided this inner transformation. And so that's such an important part of this.
When you think about that, we're now starting to understand that, you can rationalize and intellectualize things all you like, but if you don't believe it, if you don't feel it in your heart, then it doesn't really become true for you.
Right.
And I think that's something that he understood is you can think about being empathetic towards people all you like, but if you don't feel it in your heart, it's not real.
Mm-hmm.
I get where Chris is coming from that time of, cognition is king, because that hangover still sticks around in society today. And you see it even in our media. So, Spock in Star Trek prizes logic about, he can't let his human emotional side out. And we still got this thing, this Jekyll Hyde kind of, concept around the use and the value of emotions. And we keep talking about, regulating your emotions and calming yourself.
Yeah.
And, but in some way, if you don't feel those emotions, you don't feel those spurs for self-correction.
Yeah.
And I think that's what was magic about that particular theory, was that here's someone who was recognizing, like Chris has summed up much better than I have, but that without emotion, you're never going to feel that belief, and then your behavior is not going to be authentic.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to look at that context and say that we even still have some of those leftover ideas that prizes logic above emotion, but there's so much that our emotions could teach us. I guess the way I would put it is we haven't been taught the language of our emotions. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with Brene Brown, but I know she's written a book and talked about that, doing studies and saying on average, people can name about 3 emotions in themselves when really there's hundreds. Learning some of that vocabulary can be so freeing, can open doors to us. And like you're saying, the way you frame it in your theory is that's what opens us up to then be able to do some of that self-work. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like just personally in my story, when I was young, I was so disconnected from my emotions. I mean, even though I felt intensely, I didn't have people modeling emotional maturity in my life. I happened to have been born to parents who were teenagers, and I ended up growing up not being connected with my emotions, not knowing how to manage them, not knowing how to talk about them. It was a real problem. I remember later when I was in my 20s, and one of the times when I was hospitalized, they were like, you have to get in touch with your emotions. You have to be able to name them and understand them. And I was just like, Like it just felt ridiculous that it was so difficult to do that. But it was a whole long process of getting it and being able to feel, to accept feelings, to not push them away when they were uncomfortable. These things, we should grow up learning about this stuff, but we don't. I mean, we just don't. Like if we don't happen to be born in a family where this is discussed and dealt with, well, how rare is that? I mean, it doesn't take much to know that this is uncommon, and it's something that we need to work on, you know, as a society. Emotions matter and they're important. And if we could learn how to gain some kind of emotional maturity when we were young, we could save ourselves so much heartache.
I think it like social emotional learning should be taught in schools the same way like math and science are classes. I think it's kind of ridiculous to assume that children will just pick it up along the way. And that's part of when you take a communication perspective in the world, we think about communication as this abstract force that we just take for granted that we all just know how to do well. But if you're not thinking about it, if you're not being intentional, if you're not doing that self-reflection, then I don't know how anyone thinks they could find that effective communication. They might be communicating, but are they doing it in a way that's effective, that's intentional, that's productive, that leads to that creation of that better social world?
I think it goes beyond that, though, because sitting down and learning about emotions is still intellectualizing it.
That's true.
In my mind. Right? If you take, you know, kids in a classroom or people at work, right, in an office, sit down, behave, be quiet. Where is the scope for expressing those emotions? Apart from certain times when you're allowed to, say in music or in drama or in art, then you can selectively express your emotions. But the way society is built is around controlling emotional behaviors and reactions towards each other. You know, don't be angry. Don't jump up and down with excitement. Sit down, be quiet, behave. It goes deeper than just sort of learning about it on a personal level. Society is structured to control our emotional reactions in every possible way. You know, get up, go to work, you know, clock in, do the 9 to 5, go home, you know, don't get upset, don't yell. Everything in our life is around like these social guide rails that we have that are mitigating our behavior at every turn and our thoughts and you know, how we think about ourselves. And I think this comes back to the theory is when someone hasn't gone through that disintegration and thought about their own values, they're relying on those social guardrails to guide them to, you know, calm their you know, inner instincts and stuff. And I think, you know, we have to not only question our own values and guardrails internally, we've got to question the ones in broader society and say, are they helping? Are they serving? Or are they simply turning us into these robotic little, you know, automatons that are going about our business and never allowed to let our emotions out?
I think that's a great point. And I think the way I see it is that it has to happen in 2 phases almost. Of that first phase is what I'm talking about, having something like a classroom maybe where you learn that language. And I love the language. And so I feel like I could just live there forever in that spot of learning the language and how that feels within myself to know different language about my emotions that opens up new worlds inside myself for me. But then the step that has to happen beyond that, which is what I think you're trying to add, is that it can't just be in a classroom. Beyond that, what does it look like for it to act out? What does it look like in a practical sense in our lives? How does it actually manifest itself in how we're living? And I don't know what the answer is of, you know, how we can integrate that better into children's lives so that we have young people that grow up into adults that have done this work and that have done that self-reflection to be able to then go out and, you know, co-create with each other a better social world.
You just made me think, Abbie, that part of the problem is that what happens with children is that we invalidate them so easily, whether it's in the classroom or at home. And we say, no, don't feel that way. Should we tell them to shut down how they feel by telling them how to behave and what to do? Where what we need to do, I think, is let them feel, you know, when you have 2 children who are upset with each other, let them feel upset, work it out and move through it. Don't shut them down, because shutting them down teaches them that it's not okay to feel. And that's just part of how this happens, I think. But it's a real problem that obviously there's layers to it, at home, at school, in society. But yeah, I mean, if we valued children more than we do, then we would take this more seriously and we would end up with healthier adults.
Yeah, right. That's good. I want to maybe take this chance to break down the theory a little bit more. So I'm wondering if you can explain what is disintegration first, and then what is positive disintegration.
Well, interestingly, if you don't mind, I could give an example of my first major disintegration in terms of what we were just talking about.
Please, yeah.
The first time I ever fully had a disintegration that I would call like a global disintegration that really broke me down and it nearly killed me. It was showing up in me feeling, because I would be at work. And at the time I worked at Barnes & Noble, just to give context. And I was 20 or maybe 21. And I went from being somebody who was I wish I could feel, I'm cut off from my feelings, to suddenly being at work and I would just be crying and tears would just be pouring down my face. I would have to go in the break room at work because I couldn't be on the floor with customers like that, Right. So what happened was I was breaking down, and it got to the point where I didn't have control anymore. And that was part of what was so terrifying about this process of disintegration, was suddenly realizing that the things that I had a tight grip on, I didn't have a grip on anymore, and so I was kind of falling apart. And, essentially that's what happens with disintegration. Everything that you knew about, this is who I am, starts breaking down. And you get to a point, or at least I did in that example, of just fully not knowing who I was. Myself is what I meant. When I say I didn't know who I was, I just didn't have a sense of my true self. I had been so disconnected from who I was. And then when it comes to the positive part, if we're staying with my story, I made 2 suicide attempts. And so it was nearly not a positive disintegration. Right. If I had succeeded in dying by suicide, that would have been it. And it would have been a disintegration that wasn't positive. But what made it positive is that I was able to rebuild after falling apart. But it took years. I mean, it would be wrong to say that it was any quick process by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that really it was a matter of going through many disintegrations and rebuilding over a process of years. But at least that's, in a nutshell, kind of how it looked in my life.
That's definitely helpful, and I appreciate you sharing that story. Maybe Emma has something to add too.
Yeah, so that tracks with the theory and one of my experiences. So obviously the disintegration is that breaking down. And, we're talking about who we think we are and our values. You get to the, who am I? What is important to me? I don't know who I am anymore. So it's that breaking down. And as Chris said, it is a process and something that cycles through. So it's like a trend line on a graph. So if you think of a graph going, doing that sort of up and down thing, if the overall progress is going up and the overall trend's going up, then it's positive. So you will go through sort of cycles of, breaking down and rebuilding and breaking down and rebuilding. But as long as you are tracking towards a direction of growth, then that's positive. The dark night of the soul that I had before I stumbled across the theory was certainly like that. I'd started doing creative writing and found my authentic voice by accident. And that led me to go, well, who am I? I don't know what, everything I thought I knew about myself suddenly fell on its ass, to be quite frank. And I came out of this experience feeling like I'd been washed up on the shore of a beach after a shipwreck, going, oh, what has just happened to me? And that rebuilding process did take a long time. There was a lot of stuff to sort out, a lot of my past to sort of work through, things that I'd been clinging on to, concepts about myself that weren't serving me anymore. And it was a long road. And Chris has talked about this is hard work. Yeah. So you will have ups and downs and keep going through it. And over a lifetime, you can have many disintegrations. Mm-hmm. But if you are rebuilding, if you are thinking about what is important to you and reestablishing your values, if you are doing the hard work on yourself, then you are moving positively. Mm. Doesn't feel positive.
Yeah, it seems very significant to make that distinction between not all disintegration is positive. But do you feel that that's more about you're in a state of disintegration and it's about what you do with it? Or is it still about what the disintegration does to you? Are you in control of it or not, I guess?
Well, I think there's one way to help make sense of this. And that's, Dabrowski saw two developmental processes, and one was unilevel and one was multilevel. And so what Emma and I were just talking about was more the multilevel type, where you're breaking down, you're rebuilding, it's trending mm-hmm. upward, it's a positive disintegration. But the unilevel kind of disintegration is not so clearly positive, and there may not be an easy way out of it. It's interesting because one of the things that I've noticed that I disagree with, there are people in the Dabrowski community who call unilevel disintegration a transition phase and imply that it's some brief experience and that if you stay in it, it could lead to psychosis or suicide. And the reality is many people, I wouldn't say it's a transitional, phase by any stretch. And I say this as somebody who had a parent who died from alcoholism. I would say that my father was in a unilevel disintegration for decades and that it killed him and that he never managed to find a way out of it. And so I think that there are a lot of people who suffer greatly in unilevel disintegration. And one of the things that makes it different from multilevel is that it doesn't have the level of consciousness and awareness that mm-hmm. you see in multilevel. And so if you're just in autopilot mode and you're drinking every day and you're never really examining yourself or taking the risks to get out of that, then you could live in that state for a long time and it could kill you. And so that's kind of a difference between the two types. And that's kind of a more bleak view of how disintegration could look and how it might not be so positive.
But I think it feels like almost, I don't know if you would describe it this way, but like two sides of the same coin of it's important to have that distinction to understand one, to understand the other.
It's true. I mean, I know that Emma and I both have had experiences of addiction and struggles like this in our lives. And I've thought so much over, my father's been dead for more than 10 years at this point. And I've thought many times about what was different about me compared mm-hmm. to him. Why was I able to break out of this and, in a vertical direction to move out of, that suffering, and he wasn't. Yeah, it's tough. Like we seemingly had similar developmental potential in Dabrowskian terms, but we had very different ends in our lives.
Yeah. That's a good question of what makes the difference between, if you think about unilevel being the flat floor where any direction you move in, it sort of all seems the same, and multi-level is literally the staircase towards growth because mm-hmm. you've got tiny little multiple levels going up. What's the difference between someone who spots the staircase and starts to see that there's a way mm-hmm. up and someone who can't see it? It's a very good question.
And I think that's probably the important part of the theory hinges on of it's not just about are you disintegrating or not? It's what do you do when you're in that disintegration? And honestly, maybe the difference between disintegrating positively or disintegrating negatively or being stagnant, is an awareness, like having the language that the theory of positive disintegration gives you, having that, maybe what you both found in a sense of community or a sense of feeling understood when you learned about like giftedness and overexcitability, when you start talking about mental health in terms of all of it. That's just what I'm hearing from what you're saying.
I think it's relationships. I think mm-hmm. that's the difference. I believe that I was lucky in a way that my father wasn't, in that I had these supportive people in my life when I was a teenager, when I was a young adult, that he didn't have. I had connections with people who really helped me see a bigger picture, to see outside of myself. He didn't have that the way that I did. And in the work, in the research that I've done, I think that that is an element that we need to talk more about with this theory, that the difference isn't necessarily within us,
right,
per se. It's the environment that we were raised in. And, not just raised in, but continues. Like, it's our social environment.
Yeah.
And we don't all get to have that. I just feel like when I look back, it was such a luxury for me to have so many people who were invested in me, who cared about me, who were willing to go the extra mile when I needed them. Not many people have had that the way that I have. And I recognize that there's a real privilege there.
Yeah. You're hitting on exactly the thing that I think about with CMM all the time. And I said to you earlier that the core belief is we're co-creating our social worlds and at the same time being shaped by our social worlds, because CMM is really a lot about like choice and our personal power. And yet I think we have to consider our personal power also existing within the context of a system that there's so many things outside of our control. And so it's understanding both of those working in tandem in our lives. Maybe there is, to some degree, something internal within you that was able to help you move into a positive version of disintegration. But also even that thing that was internal was probably shaped by your external world that you didn't choose, that you're saying you were privileged to have, that not everybody has.
I'm going to give you a third perspective on this, which combines all the previous ones. I think it's a combination of all of the above. So some people within them will just have that innate vision to start spotting the staircase, right? And then they're going to try and trudge up it by themselves, and it's going to be really, really hard. And they might slip back down. You might be in a situation like Chris was, and certainly I was with the previous disintegration I had many years ago. I came out of a bad relationship, and I consciously sat down with the encouragement and support of those around me to think about, what did I want out of life? What was important to me? Before I get into the next relationship, what do I need to look for in a partner? And, have a real good think about what was important to me. So I had that supportive environment to be able to go through that exercise. And the process was being undertaken of, going up the staircase and thinking about, what is good for me? Who am I? Without actually knowing about the framework or having any of the labels on it. And then I think the third component is when you find out about positive disintegration and you have the name and the framework for it, that makes the journey up the staircase even easier, because now you have context of, these are stairs. I'm supposed to go up these, left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. And that can make the whole thing easier as well. So I think there are people that innately seek out the staircase or see it or spot it. But it's going to be hard work to get up by yourself. I think, some people get up it a lot easier if they've got a handrail to hang on to or someone to help them, but also understanding the purpose of a staircase and what the stairs are called and how you're supposed to use the handrail is enormously helpful. So I think it's a sort of three-pronged attack on that. And that is why I am personally so passionate about getting the theory out there, because we have this handbook, how to get up the stairs, and we're sitting on it. We know about it, and it gives you all the labels for the things, and it gives you all the, the framework for understanding what a staircase is and what it's designed to do and where you're going to get to at the end of it. We've got to share that with people. And it's a complex theory, and that's why Chris and I are really passionate about making it more accessible, and sharing our stories, to give examples, to give people that mirror to see themselves, so that they can resonate in it, because I think all of those components are really important. And if we have those, we're more likely to be successful to get up the stairs.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The kind of funny thing I want to point out is that you said it's hard work. Like, those going up the stairs are hard work. But like you said, knowing it's hard when you have the access to tools that the theory gives you, knowing it's hard makes it easier because you expect it to be hard almost. It's like if you're walking up these stairs thinking this should be a cakewalk, when it gets hard, that might send you right back down the staircase. But like you're saying, it's just how many layers deep of these additional tools that help you climb those stairs do you have? Because climbing the stairs might look harder for some people than it does for others, depending on how many resources they have. The thing I want to point out to you both now is that I know I'd already mentioned that I see, obviously, both of our theories have a lot of different nuance, but I see the theory for positive disintegration as being something that happens internally within ourselves, this disintegration that happens, the self-reflection that happens, the personal growth that happens, it's all internal. And then CMM is almost the second step of that, which is kind of using that self-reflection to go out into your external world and make changes too. Because I see CMM and thinking about how we're co-creating the world, reflecting on our external world. You can't really do that if you haven't already reflected on your internal world. And so as you've both talked, I'm reminded of these three kind of guiding questions that CMM uses. And it's, how did that get made? What are we making? And what can we do to make better social worlds? And I just see such a parallel in the theory for positive disintegration of asking those questions, but in an internal way of how did I get where I am? Where am I now? And what do I want to do in the future? That's maybe that process of disintegrating and reintegrating is a version of asking those questions of ourselves.
You're reminding me so much of the work that I was doing that brought me to the theory in the first place, which is, I was doing an autoethnography, and I took it very seriously as a personal research project. And what's funny to me is that I went into it thinking that I already had a pretty solid grasp of who I was and what I had been through. And so I was like, oh, yes, I am mentally ill, and so that's what I was studying. I was trying to understand, how could I have been gifted and end up mentally ill? Like I was trying to reconcile that. But what I discovered by opening my mind and using research methods was that I was wrong. And that, that it wasn't right to think of it as mental illness. And I discovered the theory, and I had this language that helped me, get to where I am now. But it has completely changed my story to do that. And so now I sit here and I'm like, well, I have a completely different story of how I got here and what happened than I did in 2014 when I first kicked this off. It's so interesting to me because CMM aligns so much with the research, the meaning making research, and in that kind of qualitative work. It's so cool.
Yeah, I kind of want to go off, Emma talking about saying, we have a handbook here of how to get up the staircase. And I think that's a metaphor version of saying, we have the Dabrowski Center, we have your podcast. And I just want to hear a little bit about what both of your hopes are through the work that you do, Chris, at the Dabrowski Center, through the podcast, Emma, through your YouTube channel, through all the amazing work that you all do. What's your hope for what this work can do in people's lives?
I think it comes down to the fact that because this theory isn't widely known, and it can help a section of the community, we really need to get it out there in as many spaces as humanly possible in an accessible way so it can be easily understood. I keep likening it to finding a needle in a haystack. So not everybody's going to benefit from the theory, but the haystack of humanity is 8 billion people. And because it's something that talks about psychological tension, and because it talks about, these feelings of guilt and shame and your depression, your anxiety might not be a mental illness. It might just be a product of you going through a disintegration and experiencing this stuff. We need to, in particular, try and get into the mental health space. That's really something that I've been trying to get my head around. Well, how do you do that? Because when I went through my disintegration, I certainly wasn't Googling gifted education. Yeah. I wasn't Googling positive disintegration because I didn't even know the term, nor was I Googling overexcitability. I was looking at mental health services for help. I was the thing that I Googled that accidentally led to it was, why is my brain breaking?
Yeah, what are the chances of finding the theory from that?
Yeah, complete fluke, right? So I know that there are other people out there like me doing their day jobs, trying to grapple with life at the same time as grapple with what's happening with them, that need that information.
Yeah.
Like, they can't go through all the academic research papers. They're not going to make much sense out of like stuff for in gifted education for, you know, parents of kids with overexcitability, right? And that's exactly what drove me to create the content in the first place. But it's like, now we need to get that in the places where people are going to see it. You know, that for us is the big challenge, and that's what we're hoping to do through the Dabrowski Center, is like try and kick down some doors that haven't been kicked down before, and get this message in the place where it can be seen. And we've talked about sharing stories and providing that mirror to people. It's like, now we've got to go hang that mirror on as many walls as humanly possible, because it's the only way it's going to increase the chance that the people who need it are going to have that ugly duckling moment and look in the mirror and see themselves reflected as a swan and go, oh, I'm not alone. Here's the thing. Lead them to the theory, and then they've got that handbook of how to get up the staircase. And I apologize because that was all in analogy.
I love it. I love it.
No, that was great, Emma. I loved how you put all of that. I mean, my hopes, I was just sitting here thinking, well, gosh, like my hopes are very similar. But I guess what I could add is that my hope is that we can somehow empower people to take control of their own narrative, their own lives, you know, but also kind of from a broader perspective, I hope that we can take control of the narrative around the term gifted, that we can say, okay, we're not going to let you academics be the arbiters of our experience anymore. This is a real, meaningful difference. This is a way of being that we needed to know about when we were young. And so let's start doing that, and to maybe create some kind of a grassroots effort where we, people who identify this way, make the difference ourselves, because it's never going to happen if we wait for the academics to do it. Like, we're just going to see these recycled arguments for decades more. So what can we do? So that's my hope, is to be some kind of catalyst, but also I recognize my limitations to some extent. And I know that I'm meant personally to be kind of a conduit for knowledge, to bring the knowledge together, to help people have access to it and the resources, and to do some community building. That's another important aspect of our work. And of course, the podcast has been a great way to start it, because, you know, people find it, they feel seen by us and mirrored by us. And it's been so incredible to have this experience of doing it already with Emma. Like, it's already exceeded my expectations. I just had no idea when we got into this how special it would be. And I'm really grateful that we've had the chance to talk with you about all of this, Abbie, because CMM and this podcast, I feel like you've done a really good job of getting us to talk about this stuff in a way that hasn't happened yet. So thank you.
I really appreciate that. And I think I just see so many parallels between the Dabrowski Center and the CMM Institute, my podcast and your podcast, because really I'll share that this podcast started as my senior thesis project that I was doing in college. And I just decided I was going to do a podcast. I was going to pick a communication theory. So I opened up my comm theory textbook, and I picked this theory for a couple of reasons, but all in all, kind of like Emma searching in the computer, why is my brain broken? I really just happened to pick CMM and happened to read in that textbook that, by the way, there's a CMM Institute. You can find it here. There is not another institute for a communication theory that exists. And so this opportunity for me to keep doing the podcast came when I reached out to them. And so it turned into more than this project. And it's just, I can just see it so clearly what it's done for me, and what I would add to my answer, I guess, to the question that I asked both of you. My hope is that I can think of myself sitting in classes, learning all the information from all these theories that have to do with the psychology, that have to do with the sociology of, all of these things happening inside ourselves and in our world. And I just want to be able to pick up that feeling that I got in a school setting and hand it to everybody else in the world. I see myself as sort of a translator, one foot in academia, one foot in, I don't know, like the secular world, to be the one to pass this information back and forth, to be what I see as part of that process between phase 1 and phase 2, which is going from just having the language to putting something into practice. So I'm excited about the work that you're doing with the Dabrowski Center. And I don't know, maybe it's a conversation for us of if there's ways we can further collaborate in the future, because I'm definitely interested in just learning more, because I even see myself as, being in a phase of disintegration right now. Like, I grew up with messages that made me believe that everything was very black and white. There's good, bad, there's right, wrong. And as I've gone further into my life, there's just so much gray, is how I would say it. And so I want to lean into that complexity. I want to lean into having these deeper understandings of the way that the world actually does work. And that's a really hard thing to do. So it's this kind of deconstruction or disintegration of everything I thought I knew. And I want to, keep building my own tool box, including the theory for positive disintegration to help me get up those stairs. And then maybe as the way I see the work that you're doing and the work that I'm doing is to be walking up those stairs, turn around and hold your hand out and say, let me help you come up these stairs too, to so many other people. And so I really commend you for the work that you all are doing. And I'm excited that I've gotten to speak with you today, because I think you've provided a lot of great insight and perspective that enriches my own experience of the world. And I hope a lot of people's understanding too.
Thanks for that. That's very, very kind. And I just want to hit back to something both of you touched on there. So you talked about being a conduit, Abbie, and Chris, you were talking about, being a conduit for knowledge. So it's almost like a Voltron robot, where we've got a lot of little robots and we want to bolt them together to make one big super robot, right? So you talked about CMM fitting on to the other side of positive disintegration, where it can provide those ways for people to be thinking about their autopsychotherapy and how are they going to behave now, and walk that talk, right? So, and we've talked about wanting to bolt into the mental health sphere. So when people are seeking that help, they've got a channel to come through, maybe find the theory, maybe help themselves, maybe then go on to other things. And I know one area that Chris and I are trying to puzzle around now is, the more people contact us, sometimes we get things like, oh, is there a therapist in my area that works with gifted people or knows about the theory? And, that's another area that we need to bolt onto this giant robot as well, is like, how do we get these tools in the hands of the people that are out there working with clients and, help them get across the theory as well, so that they are equipped to help people who are gifted, people who are neurodivergent, people who are going through positive disintegration. So it's going to be a collaboration between all these components of us working in our little space and our own little lion robot, but then figuring out how to bolt all the little lion robots together to form the big giant robot.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a collaboration. It's a co-creation for sure.
Totally. Yeah. I'm very interested in collaboration, and I'm really excited about this, like about CMM and your work, because it's so interesting to me, like how these things just keep coming around. Like, I don't even know how to say it, but like when you reached out and I read the website and read what you were doing and then listened to a couple episodes, I was like, oh my gosh, like it's so resonant with what I care about, like from my work as a qualitative researcher and knowing like how powerful our stories are, and like seeing how changing my story has changed my life has like, I know that there's just so much more we can do with this. But part of the problem is that it's hard to convince people that you can change your story and that you can take control of the narrative.
Yes, that's huge. And along with stories, another big word that we use in CMM is talking about our patterns. And I think that's what's really hard. Like you're saying, you had this story in your head about what it meant for you to be gifted, or all of these labels that other people had put on you, and what you thought that meant for you. That was a story. And so part of your disintegration was writing a new story for yourself. And I think writing a news story for yourself is so important for everyone to do, because that means they've done some reflecting, they've done some question asking, they've realized, okay, meaning is not innate, it's created. So let me make a choice about what I want to create here. But yeah, that's really cool. I'm glad that you see those connections too, because I'm always looking for, things that resonate with me. I like to latch onto those. So I'm hyper aware of CMM resonating with me and the theory for positive disintegration as well. That's cool.
You've hit on something else innately, and that is the power of stories. I am like, I said at the beginning, all I have is my stories to share, and that's it. But the more we do the podcast, the more I understand how helpful that is, and the power of lived experience stories when it comes to explaining the theory to people.
Yeah.
It's really important to not just, have it as this cognitive. We've been talking about the power of emotions, right? You can't just have it as this intellectualized cognitive theory in the abstract. You've got to pull it down and make it applicable, and you do that through storytelling.
It humanizes it, right?
Yeah, exactly. I can't help but think in analogies, so that's really where I go, like first port of call. But there is some resistance in, accepting the power of those lived experience stories and saying, oh, well, you're just putting someone else's lens on the theory, and they're, anytime I think you go to a purist place of going, well, you have to learn the theory in an academic manner, and you're sort of invalidating the power of learning it through storytelling. That's kind of a harmful thing. So I think this is a powerful space to be in, because it validates what we're doing from the perspective of saying lived experience and connecting with other people and having that shared reality with them is a perfectly valid way about learning about these things.
Absolutely. And I think I'm glad that maybe that's even a lesson like you're learning, because early on I, hear you say, oh, maybe Chris has a better or a more academic explanation, kind of making your explanation or your experience seem not as valid as Chris's, but it absolutely is. Like, people come to this theory, and ideally more people will come to it, Emma, the way that you have now, because of how accessible you're making it. And I think that's great.
Me too. I think that's great too. And thank you for pointing that out, because it's exciting. So true.
Yeah. Well, I want to go ahead and start wrapping this up. And the way that I like to do that is using the lens of CMM, using the language of CMM to kind of contextualize and reflect on the conversation we've just had by asking, what does a better social world look like in terms of the theory for positive disintegration? And as I think back on our conversation, I'll go ahead and kind of provide my answers to that question. And I think part of that better social world in terms of positive disintegration is getting that toolbox, that handbook, whatever you called it, getting that to more people and sharing more of those stories. I think that's certainly a way to a better social world. So I wonder what all you would add to that from our conversation or from other thoughts you have.
The first thing that comes to mind to me is having a goal or a problem outside of ourselves. That is one of the important aspects of the theory. When people are at higher levels of development in this theory, they're not egocentric. They are putting as much effort into other people as they are into themselves. And so I think that that's a part of this that I can contribute. Is a better social world means that we are caring about our neighbor as much as ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think I'll touch on one of the other important points of the theory is authenticity, because when you're working on self, what you're building towards is being more authentic, more aligned with the values that you hold dear, acting in a way towards other people which is more authentic and more like you. And I think from a social perspective, working on making society a more authentic place, not only in our ability to express ourselves authentically and be ourselves and be different, and be accepted for that difference, but to look at some of the social structures that we've got in place, those guardrails, and question them, and have the ability to not only question our inner values, but to question the wider social, values, and say,
absolutely,
what are we doing by forcing, all sorts of people who are arguably, different shaped pegs into a round hole and cramming everybody into the same space. So that's another thing that I think that I would add would make a better social world would be to give people the freedom and the safety to be authentic, and the safety to be able to challenge the authenticity of the broader world.
Beautiful. Well said. Anything else you all want to add before we end our conversation? I've enjoyed everything that you've said so far and feel like it's going to leave me with a lot to think about already that I'm excited to spend some time ruminating on. But I just want to give one more chance if you got anything else you wanted to share.
I don't think so. I just want to thank you. I'm sitting here thinking that I'm really excited that we've reached a place where our story now, Emma, is that we're like these two people trying to bring this theory to the masses and help them see themselves in it and, give them like the guidebook and to give them direction. And so, Abbie, thanks for helping us sit here, articulate these things, and help me have such a clear vision of that, because I think it's kind of a beautiful outcome. And I am feeling very grateful. And so thanks so much for inviting us to do this. It's been really such a pleasure.
Of course. I'm so happy to help.
Yeah, thank you. It has been great to be able to be in a space where we can sort of openly and freely share our stories. And Chris, you sort of hit the nail on the head that, that's what we want to do. And I think it takes a little bit of bravery to be authentic, to share stories, and even to challenge the way, with CMM that you're communicating with other people. This does take a little bit of hard work. Yep. The spurs, everything we talked about today is, everything's hard work. And you do have to be a little bit brave. But I think the last thing I want to say to people is you're not alone. There are people, as you said, Abbie, that will put their hand out to help you up that staircase. We are there to help people and give them a hand as well. And that, I guess that's the one message that I want to leave is, it seems scary to, be authentic or to share your story or to challenge the way that you're communicating with other people or to try and make that difference in the world that you want to make, but you're not alone. And it's frightening, but there are people there that are going to put their hand out and help you.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Chris and Emma, and all for our Unheard Stories series. At the end of each episode, I like to offer up some questions to reflect on, which act as next turns, so the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. You can see that we have taken that to heart based on all the other conversations that are being generated between myself, Sergey, Chris, Emma, and others in our communities around the relationship between these two theories and how they can work together in a meaningful way to influence people's lives. So the questions I would have you think about today are: what resonates with you from the theory of positive disintegration? How can we start to challenge the framework we have about cognition and emotion? And how can we work together to co-create a new framework that better honors emotions? I'd also have you think about how we might use the theory of positive disintegration along with CMM and everything we know about a communication perspective to equip ourselves to lean into the challenge of deconstructing and reconstructing our values. And finally, what makes you feel empowered to take control of your own narrative? And how can you seek out language, tools, and community that encourage that? How can you empower yourself and others to do the same? Along with those questions, which are specific to this episode, you can be continuing to think about all the conversations that we have had this month and how they all are examples of unheard stories and how together we have made some of those unheard stories heard. I would encourage you to continue to look for unheard stories in your own life and try to tell them where you can and make the space for them to be told where you can. You can reach out to me to share your reflections on these questions, on this month, any of the conversations we've had, any of your own questions or ideas as well. And you can do that through email, the website, by commenting on Instagram and YouTube, or by engaging on the Substack. Links to all those places are in the show notes. The reason I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue. Other great ways to keep dialogue going is to follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, and most importantly to me, share this episode or any other episode that's been meaningful to you with someone you want to invite into the conversation. I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to create space for more conversations that move us toward those better social worlds we hope to create. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives at the links I've provided in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.